Hiber-Nation 56. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Read by David Grizzly Smith. Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton, as read by David Grizzly Smith. The Pacing Mustang. Part 1. Joe Cologne threw down his saddle on the dusty ground, turned his horses loose, and went clanking into the ranch house. "Nigh about chuck time?" he asked. 17 minutes, said the cook, glancing at the Waterbury with the air of a train starter, though this show of precision had never yet been justified by events. "How's things on the Perico?" said Joe's pard. "Hotter'n hinges," said Joe. "Cattle seem okay. Lots of calves. I seen that bunch of Mustangs that waters at Antelope Springs. Couple of colts along. One little dark one, a fair dandy. Born pacer. I run them a mile or two, and he led the bunch, and never broke his pace. Cut loose and pushed him just for fun, and darned if I could make him break." "You didn't take no refreshments along?" said Scarth incredulously. That's all right, Scarth. You had to crawl on our last bet, and you'll get another chance soon as you're man enough." "Chuck!" shouted the cook, and the subject was dropped. Next day the scene of the roundup was changed, and the Mustangs were forgotten. Year later, the same corner of New Mexico was worked over by the roundup, and again the Mustang bunch was seen. The dark colt was now a black yearling, with thin, clean legs and glossy flanks, and more than one of the boys saw with his own eyes this oddity. The Mustang was a born pacer. Joe was along, and the idea now struck him that colt was worth having. To an Easterner this thought may not seem startling or original, but in the West, where an unbroken horse is worth $5, and where an ordinary saddle horse is worth $15 or $20, the idea of a wild Mustang being desirable property does not occur to the average cowboy, for Mustangs are hard to catch, and when caught are merely wild animal prisoners, perfectly useless and untamable to the last. And not a few of the cattle owners make a point of shooting all Mustangs at sight, for they are not only useless cumberers of the feeding grounds, but commonly lead away domestic horses, which soon take to the wild life and are thenceforth lost. Wild Joe Cologne knew a bronc right down to the subsoil. I never seen a white that wasn't soft, nor a chestnut that wasn't nervous, nor a bay that wasn't good if broke right, nor a black that wasn't hard as nails and full of old Harry. All a black bronc wants is claws to be wuss'n Daniel's whole outfit of lions. Well, since then, a Mustang is worthless vermin, and a black Mustang is 10 times worse than worthless. Joe's pard didn't see no sense in Joe's wanting to corral the yearling, as he now seemed intent on doing. But Joe got no chance to try that year. He was only a cow puncher on $25 a month and tied to hours. Like most of the boys, he always looked forward to having a ranch and outfit of his own. His brand, the Hog Pen of sinister suggestion, was already registered at Santa Fe, but of horn stock it was borne by a single old cow, so as to give him a legal right to put his brand on any maverick or unbranded animal he might chance to find. Yet each fall, when paid off, Joe could not resist the temptation to go to town with the boys and have a good time, while the stuff held out, so that his property consisted of little more than his saddle, his bed, and his old cow. He kept on hoping to make a strike that would leave him well fixed with a fair start, and when the thought came that that black Mustang was his mascot, he only needed a chance to make the try. The roundup circled down to the Canadian River and back in the fall by the Don Carlos Hills, and Joe saw no more of the pacer, though he heard of him from many quarters, for the colt, now a vigorous young horse, rising 3, was beginning to be talked of. Antelope Springs is in the middle of a great level plain. When the water is high, it spreads into a small lake with a belt of sedge around it. And when it is low, there is a wide flat of black mud, glistening white with alkali in places, in the spring a water hole in the middle. It has no flow or outlet, and yet is fairly good water, the only drinking place for many miles. Now this flat, or prairie as it would be called farther north, was the favorite feeding ground of the Black Stallion, but it was also the pasture for many herds of range horses and cattle. Chiefly interested was the L-Cross-F outfit. Foster, the manager and part owner, was a man of enterprise. He believed it would pay to handle a better class of cattle and horses on the range, and one of his ventures was 10 half-blooded mares, tall, clean-limbed, deer-eyed creatures that made the scrub cow-ponies look like pitiful starvelings of some degenerate and quite different species. One of these was kept stabled for use, but the 9, after the weaning of their colts, managed to get away and wandered off on the range. A horse has a fine instinct for the road to the best feed, and the 9 mares drifted, of course, to the prairie of Antelope Springs, 20 miles to the southward. And when, later that summer, Foster went to round them up, he found the 9 indeed, but with them and guarding them with an air of more than mere comradeship was a coal-black stallion, prancing around and rounding up the bunch like an expert, his jet-black coat a vivid contrast to the golden hides of his harem. The mares were gentle, and would have been easily driven homeward, but for a new and unexpected thing. The Black Stallion became greatly aroused. He seemed to inspire them, too, with his wildness, and flying this way and that way, drove the whole band at full gallop where he would. Away they went, and the little cow-ponies that carried the men were easily left behind. Well, this was maddening, and both men at last drew their guns and sought a chance to drop that blasted stallion. But no chance came that was not 9 to 1 of dropping one of the mares. A long day of maneuvering made no change. The pacer, for it was he, kept his family together and disappeared among the southern sandhills. The cattlemen on their jaded ponies set out for home, with the poor satisfaction of vowing vengeance for their failure on the superb cause of it. One of the most aggravating parts of it was that 1 or 2 experiences like this would surely make the mares as wild as the Mustang, and there seemed to be no way of saving them from it. Now, scientists differ on the power of beauty and prowess to attract female admiration among the lower animals, but whether it is admiration or the prowess itself, it is certain that a wild animal of uncommon gifts soon wins a large following from the harems of his rivals. And the great black horse, with his inky mane and tail and his green lighted eyes, reigns through all that region, and added to his following from many bands, till not less than a score of mares were in his bunch. Most were merely humble cow-ponies turned out to range, but the 9 great mares were there, a striking group by themselves. Of according to all reports, this bunch was always kept rounded up and guarded with such energy and jealousy that a mare, once in it, was a lost animal, so far as man was concerned. And the ranchmen realized soon that they had gotten on the range a Mustang that was doing them more harm than all the other sources of loss put together. Part 2. It was December, 1893. I was new in the country and was setting out from the ranch house on the Pena Vititos to go with a wagon to the Canadian River. As I was leaving, Foster finished his remark by, "And if you get a chance to draw a bead on that accursed Mustang, don't fail to drop him in his tracks." This is the first I had heard of him, and as I rode along I gathered from Burns, my guide, the history that has been given. I was full of curiosity to see the famous 3-year-old, and was not a little disappointed on the second day when we came to the prairie on Antelope Springs and saw no sign of the pacer or his band. But on the next day, as we crossed the Alamosa Arroyo and were rising to the rolling prairie again, Jack Burns, who was riding on ahead, suddenly dropped flat on the neck of his horse and swung him back to me in the wagon, saying, "Get your rifle out. Here's that blankety-blank stallion." Well, I seized my rifle and hurried forward to a view over the prairie ridge. In the hollow below was a band of horses, and there at one end was the great black Mustang. He had heard some sound of our approach and was not unsuspicious of danger. There he stood with head and tail erect and nostrils wide, an image of horse perfection and beauty, as noble an animal as ever ranged the plains, and the mere notion of turning that magnificent creature into a massive carrion was horrible. In spite of Jack's exhortation to shoot quick, I delayed, threw open the breech, whereupon he, always hot and hasty, swore at my slowness, growled, "Gimme that gun," and as he seized it, I turned the muzzle up, and, accidentally, the gun went off. Instantly, the herd below was all alarmed, the great black leader snorted and neighed and dashed about, and the mares bunched, and away all went in a rumble of hoofs and a cloud of dust. The stallion careered now on this side, now on that, and kept his eye on all, and led and drove them far away. As long as I could see, I watched, and never once did he break his pace. Jack made Western remarks about me and my gun, as well as that Mustang, but I rejoiced in the pacer's strength and beauty, and not for all the mares in the bunch would I have harmed his glossy hide. Part 3. There are several ways of capturing wild horses. One is by creasing, that is, grazing the animal's nape with a rifle ball so that he's stunned long enough for hobbling. "Yes, I've seen about 100 necks broke trying it, but I never seen a Mustang creased yet," was Wild Joe's critical remark. Sometimes, if the shape of the country abets it, the herd can be driven into a corral. Sometimes, with extra fine mounts, they can be run down. But by far the commonest way, paradoxical as it may seem, is to walk them down. Now, the fame of the stallion that never was known to gallop was spreading. Extraordinary stories were told of his gait, his speed, and his wind, and when old Montgomery of the Triangle Bar outfit came out plump at Wells Hotel in Clayton, and in presence of witnesses said he'd give $1,000 cash for him safe in a boxcar, providing the stories were true, a dozen young cowpunchers were eager to cut loose and win the purse, as soon as present engagements were up. But Wild Joe had had his eye on this very deal for quite a while, and there was no time to lose. So, ignoring present contracts, he rustled all night to raise the necessary equipment for the game. Well, by straining his already overstrained credit and taxing the already overtaxed generosity of his friends, he got together an expedition consisting of 20 good saddle horses, a mess wagon, and a fortnight's stuff for 3 men, himself, his pard, Charlie, and the cook. Well, then they set out from Clayton with the avowed intention of walking down the wonderfully swift wild horse. The third day they arrived at Antelope Springs, and as it was about noon, they were not surprised to see the black pacer marching down to drink with all his band behind him. Joe kept out of sight until the wild horses each and all had drunk their fill, for a thirsty animal always travels better than one laden with water. Joe then rode quietly forward. The pacer took alarm at 1/2 mile and led his band away out of sight on the soapweed mesa to the southeast. Joe followed at a gallop till he once more sighted them, and then came back and instructed the cook, who was also teamster, to make for Alamosa Arroyo in the south. Then, away to the southeast, he went after the mustangs. After a mile or two, he once more sighted them, and walked his horse quietly till so near that again they took alarm and circled away to the south. An hour's trot, not on the trail, but cutting across to where they ought to go, brought Joe again in close sight. Again he walked quietly toward the herd, and again there was the alarm and flight. And so they passed the afternoon, but circled ever more and more to the south, so that when the sun was low they were, as Joe had expected, not far from Alamosa Arroyo. The band was again close at hand, and Joe, after starting them off, rode to the wagon, while his pard, who had been taking it easy, took up the slow chase on a fresh horse. After supper, the wagon was moved on to the upper ford of the Alamosa, as arranged, and there camped for the night. Well, meanwhile, Charlie followed the herd. They had not run so far as at first, for their pursuer made no sign of attack, and they were getting used to his company. They were more easily found, as the shadows fell, on account of a snow-white mare that was in the bunch. A young moon in the sky now gave some help, and relying on his horse to choose the path, Charlie kept him quietly walking after the herd, represented by that ghost white mare, till they were lost in the night. Then he got off, unsaddled and picketed his horse, and in his blanket quickly went to sleep. At the first streak of dawn he was up, and within a short 1/2 mile, thanks to the snowy mare, he found the band. At his approach, the shrill neigh of the pacer bugled his troop into a flying squad, but on the first mesa they stopped and faced about to see what this persistent follower was and what he wanted. For a moment or so they stood against the sky to gaze, and then, deciding that he knew him as well as he wished to, that black meteor flung his mane on the wind and led off at his tireless, even swing, while the mares came streaming after. Away they went, circling now to the west, and after several repetitions of this same play, flying, following, and overtaking, and flying again, they passed near noon the old Apache lookout, Buffalo Bluff. And here, on watch, was Joe. A long, thin column of smoke told Charlie to come to camp, and with a flashing pocket mirror he made response. Joe, freshly mounted, rode across and again took up the chase, and back came Charlie to camp to eat and rest and then move on upstream. All that day Joe followed and managed, when it was needed, that the herd should keep the great circle, of which the wagon cut a small cord. At sundown he came to Verde Crossing, and there was Charlie with a fresh horse and food, and Joe went on in the same calm, dogged way. All the evening he followed and far into the night, for the wild herd was now getting somewhat used to the presence of the harmless strangers and were more easily followed. Moreover, they were tiring out with perpetual traveling. They were no longer in the good grass country, and they were not grain-fed like the horses on their track, and above all, the slight but continuous nervous tension was surely telling. Spoiled their appetites, but made them very thirsty. They were allowed, as far as possible encouraged, to drink deeply at every chance. The effect of large quantities of water on a running animal is well known. It tends to stiffen the limbs and spoil the wind. Joe carefully guarded his own horse against such excess, and both he and his horse were fresh when they camped that night on the trail of the jaded mustangs. At dawn he found them easily close at hand, and though they ran at first, they did not go far before they dropped into a walk. The battle seemed nearly won now, for the chief difficulty in the walk down is to keep track of the herd the first 2 or 3 days when they're fresh. All that morning Joe kept in sight, generally in close sight of the band. About 10 o'clock, Charlie relieved him near Jose Peak, and that day the mustangs walked only a quarter of a mile ahead with much less spirit than the day before, and circled now more north again. At night Charlie was supplied with a fresh horse and followed as before. The next day the mustangs walked with heads held low, and in spite of the efforts of the black pacer, at times they were less than 100 yards ahead of their pursuer. The 4th and 5th days passed the same way, and now the herd was nearly back to Antelope Springs. So far, all had come out as expected. The chase had been in a great circle, with the wagon following a lesser circle. The wild herd was back to its starting point, worn out, and the hunters were back, fresh and on fresh horses. The herd was kept from drinking till late in the afternoon, and then driven to the springs to swell themselves with a perfect water gorge. Now was the chance for the skillful ropers on the grain-fed horses to close in, for the sudden heavy drink was ruination, almost paralysis of wind and limb, and it would be easy to rope and hobble them one by one. There was only one weak spot in the program. The Black Stallion, the cause of the hunt, seemed made of iron, and that ceaseless swinging pace seemed as swift and vigorous now as on the morning when the chase began. Up and down he went, rounding up the herd and urging them on by voice and example to escape. But they were played out. The old white mare that had been such help in sighting them at night had dropped out hours ago, dead beat. The half-bloods seemed to be losing all fear of the horseman, and the band was clearly in Joe's power. But the one who was the prize of all the hunt seemed just as far as ever out of reach. Here was a puzzle. Joe's comrades knew him well, and would not have been surprised to see him in a sudden rage attempt to shoot the stallion down. But Joe had no such mind. During that long week of following, he had watched that horse all day at speed, and never once had seen him gallop. The horseman's adoration of a noble horse had grown and grown till now he would as soon have thought of shooting his best mount as firing on that splendid beast. Joe even asked himself whether he would take the handsome sum that was offered for the prize. Such an animal would be a fortune in himself to sire a race of pacers for the track. But the prize was still at large. The time had come to finish up the hunt. Joe's finest mount was caught. She was a mare of eastern blood, but raised on the plains. She never would have come into Joe's possession but for a curious weakness. Now the loco is a poisonous weed that grows in these regions. Most stock will not touch it, but sometimes an animal tries it and becomes addicted to it. It acts somewhat like morphine, but the animal, though sane for long intervals, has always a mad passion for the herb and finally dies mad. A beast with the craze is said to be locoed, and Joe's best mount had a wild gleam in her eye that to an expert told a tale. But she was swift and strong, and Joe chose her for the grand finish of the chase. It would have been an easy matter now to rope the mares, but was no longer necessary. They could be separated from their black leader and driven home to the corral. But that leader still had the look of untamed strength. Joe, rejoicing in a worthy foe, went bounding forth to try the odds. The lasso was flung on the ground and trailed to take out every kink, and gathered as he rode into the neatest coils across his left palm. Then, putting on the spur the first time in that chase, he rode straight for the stallion a quarter of a mile beyond. Away he went, and away went Joe, each at his best, while the fagged-out mares scattered right and left and let them pass. Straight across the open plain the fresh horse went at its hardest gallop, and the stallion, leading off, still kept his start and kept his famous swing. It was incredible, and Joe put on more spur and shouted to his horse, which fairly flew, but shortened up the space between by not a single inch. For the black one whirled across the flat and up and past a soapweed mesa and down across a sandy, treacherous plain, then over a grassy stretch where prairie dogs barked, and then hid below, and on came Joe. But there to see, could he believe his eyes, the stallion's start grown longer still, and Joe began to curse his luck and urge and spur his horse until the poor uncertain brute got into such a state of nervous fright. Her eyes began to roll. She wildly shook her head from side to side, no longer picked her ground. A badger hole received her foot, and down she went, and Joe went flying to the earth. Though badly bruised, he gained his feet and tried to mount his crazy beast. But she, poor brute, was done for. Her off foreleg hung loose. There was but one thing to do. Joe loosed the cinch, put Lightfoot out of pain, and carried back the saddle to the camp, while the pacer steamed away till lost to view. Now this was not quite defeat, for all the mares were manageable now, and Joe and Charlie drove them carefully to the L-F corral and claimed a good reward. But Joe was more than ever bound to own that stallion. He had seen what stuff he was made of. He prized him more and more, and only sought to strike some better plan to catch him. Thank you for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzliesgrowls.com. This program is offered under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.